All right, one other tool that is useful is, we talked a little bit about there was like move and then resize, or move and scale rather, and you didn't really see me use scale. Now, for things like a rectangle, it's basically the same thing, right? I move it, it's now a bigger rectangle. That feels like scaling, right? But what happens if I grab something that has like text in it or something along those lines? Well, it'll change the bounds of the frame, but it'll leave all the text the same size, right? Scale is like, no, you weren't listening to me, right? What I really want to do is I want to make the thing bigger. So you hit the scale tool, it'll actually scale the type as well, right? And so you can kind of do both in this case. So yeah, if it's like, no, I don't want to change the bounds and reflow the text. I literally want to biggerize everything, right? That is when you pull the scale tool. Obviously, the key for the scale tool is, you guessed it, the letter K. I don't make the rules here. I just have to tell you about them. OK, so the other thing that we are going to do in this course, it would be really great if we spent the day together and I showed you how to start from a perfect empty Figma and create the correct way to do everything. And that would be wonderful until the first time we can blame other people and say, until you receive somebody else's Figma file and it's not using some of these practices, and then you're like, now you're just sad and resentful. But we all know who everyone's least favorite engineer is, right? You 6 months ago. You 6 months ago racked up some tech debt that current you has to deal with. So let's look about how to take a design. As I mentioned before, I mocked this up, but I did bad things, right? When I say there's no concepts of frames, there's a few frames in here for where like doing it the bad way was so tedious that I couldn't take it anymore, right? And so for some of the buttons, they're technically frames in this case. But what I want to do is show you a few ways you can begin to take something that isn't set up great and begin to bring order to the universe. And we won't take everything we learn and apply it to this, because it's just tedious in its own right. But we'll take a few of these concepts so you can kind of like figure out how to apply it. We're not going to get it all the way to perfection, but we'll kind of use it as like a case study as we go through. So like I said, there's no real concept of layers here, of grouping in any way, shape, or form. I, at the very least, named the layers for my own sanity, but that's about it. So there's a few things that we can do here. So for instance, like, let's say I want to move this card. Right now, it's real hard because nothing has any sense of grouping or hierarchy to it, right? And this is both sad to design with and sad if hypothetically you're a front-end engineer who receives this, because then you basically have to like reverse engineer the component hierarchy, right? We can argue that getting some of these hierarchy and like organization and structural pieces right in the design either helps, if you're doing it, it helps future you, the engineer implementing it, right? Or like if there's some old Figma around, like your current designer is great, everyone knows that. But maybe the previous designer wasn't, right? And you still have that design that you're working with, and you're the one implementing it. It's helpful for you, then at least you to be the one that brings order to this as well, right? And like I said, this, I started using this tool at work, but then eventually on side projects and other things, instead of like, you get an idea for a side project and you start writing code, and then you realize your layout is terrible, and you start tweaking stuff by hand, this is a lot easier. So how do we bring some order to this? Well, for some of these pieces, we could actually just select, and like I said before, we can hit Command-Option-G, and now I can move this thing around as one kind of contiguous unit. Now, you might imagine that you could probably make subframes in here as well, right? Chances are that I want to maybe move the name and the company around at the same time. So you could theoretically, command click and hold shift and create additional frames as well. Like I'll do one here. And I could make that a frame, so now I can move this around within the bounds. Also, kind of like in the same way that you would look at like a JPEG of a UI, and in your front-end engineer brain try to like reverse engineer the component structure, those neural pathways are super helpful right now, right? Because it's the same idea. And like, frankly, I would be lying to you if I said that I didn't sometimes just do this as I'm thinking about the architecture of a UI as well, right? Looking at it, kind of drawing, even before Figma, you draw some boxes around some stuff. You think about like, what is the component structure before you start digging a hole of tech debt as you just start writing code. Like stopping and thinking and breaking stuff down is super useful. So there's a bunch of stuff. We can grab, like for instance, hold Shift, and we can grab a few different things here as well and see if we get everything here. And one of the ways to check is just to see, I missed something. Grab all of that, put it in a frame, and now I can move this around as well. The other thing that we could do is, there's some cases where this background, or even over here, like if I wanted to basically eventually move both the heading and the search field, like let's say this is a contiguous unit of my UI. There's no like even implicit box rectangle that this is over. Like this, before I made a frame, was just a rectangle that had some text just on top of it. When I turned it into a frame, there's an invisible box that the rectangle is in with everything else that I'm moving around. Eventually, I'd probably delete the rectangle and change the background color of the frame. But we have this other issue here, which is like behind these two cards, if I wanted to move like this entire section around, that's just the iPhone background, right? There's nothing for me to kind of grab onto here. The super interesting thing is if you just you hit the F key, and you kind of just draw where you wish there was a frame. I wish my code worked like this, right? Like, I'm just going to write the code that I wish had like APIs, right? I'm going to like pretend I have the APIs that I wish the backend engineers gave me, right? It doesn't work for engineering, but it does work in Figma in this case. You can kind of draw the box around it, and you'll see in this case that let's see, did I get it right? Yep. That it kind of implicitly put everything that I ensnared in that frame inside of it, right? And so these things were not in the same frame. There was no real common rectangle that they were in front of. I just drew a square around both of them, and I got a mostly accurate, actually completely accurate frame where there was none before, right? And like I said, we can keep going with this. I won't belabor the point. I kind of like, in cooking shows where they have, like, they show you how to like make a turkey, and then there's one that they pull out of the oven 4 seconds later, right? As if it had been cooked, as if like time elapsed, right? We have one that's kind of all parted out that we can kind of use as well. But this technique works, and again, you can either take existing things, select them all, hit Command-Option-G, or when you don't have anything to work with, like again here, if I wanted to kind of zoom in a little bit, I can see like there's a difference there. And it will snap to like where other shapes are. That these are now implicitly inside of a frame. And I can kind of begin to draw out and componentize my UI, which is, again, helpful if you're the one maintaining this design. Also helpful if like you want to use any of those measurement tools and you didn't have the right kind of like hierarchy and structure, right? Kind of like when HTML has no like real like divs or anything, and you can't like move stuff around. Like you can kind of bring order to some of the chaos that in this case I made, but sometimes you've inherited. You can kind of pull this in and begin to bring some structure to it as well.